So, welcome everyone. We have where I'm delighted to introduce Jonathan Wallace, a soon-to-be master's degree graduate.
He's a graduate.
No, he hasn't graduated yet.
Oh, my bad, sorry.
Yeah, he told me he's still got another week until graduation from Lehigh University. And as a introduction here, I'd like to tell you guys a little bit about EdMap, in case you are unfamiliar. Sorry if I'm stealing any thunder here. But we, at the survey, we work through USGS, their grant program, NCGMP.
The National Cooperative Geologic Mapping Program.
Thank you. All acronyms nowadays. And so we receive funds through their state map program, but there's also another arm of funding called EdMap, which goes to universities to fund mapping projects that matches students with mentors and the survey. So we're a collaborator on Jonathan's project that he's going to be sharing with you guys. So it's a neat program to give students in the geosciences hands-on field experience and what it's like to create geologic maps. And this it gets submitted as part of any other mapping project, as part of the National Geologic Map Synthesis Project and NGM, the database, all the acronyms. It just goes everywhere. So I thought this would be a good experience for us to see what the EdMap project's all about. So with that, I am going to finally turn it over to Jonathan. All right, so come on over. So this is your speaker, right, in notes, and if you want to use the laser pointer, I would suggest you use that, and that way the people online can see it.
Excellent.
Okay.
Good evening, everybody. I am very pleased to be here. As I was so kindly introduced by Al, my name is Jonathan Wallace. I am recently completed my master's thesis at Lehigh University. The title of my talk, as you can see, is Quantifying the Pleistocene Incision and Integration History of the Middle Allegheny River. And so this talk is about some data and work that I've collected over the past couple of years, which forms the core of my master's thesis. For a few seconds of biography about me, I obtained my undergraduate degree in geology from Temple University, and then I worked in the environmental consulting industry and also as a construction worker because COVID. And eventually found my way back into academia with my advisor, Frank Passaglia at Lehigh University. I want to thank Harrisburg Area Geological Society for having me here today. And so this was perhaps not a stereotypical EdMap project as conceptualized by the USGS, but there is a map and there is a cross-section. So by golly, you can see pictured here on this first slide, the Allegheny River near Parker City, Pennsylvania, at its confluence with the Clarion River. And this is one of the main areas of interest that we'll be looking at tonight. So a few more preliminary remarks and acknowledgements. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the many, many people without whose help and guidance I could not have accomplished any of this, most especially my advisor, Frank Passaglia, and my committee members, Steve Peters and Drew Germanowski. I'd also like to recognize Fred Zelt and Gary Flieger, as well as Jocelyn Spencer of the Glacial Sand and Gravel Company and John Vincent of the Vincent Excavating and Gravel Company, without whose cooperation and access to their sites, some of this work could not have been done, as well as financial support from the USGS EdMap program, the Pennsylvania Geological Survey, and of course, the Graduate Fund at Lehigh University. So the main goal today is that I am going to be laying out, as I said, some data collected over the past few years as my master's thesis, as well as some background that helps put it in the context of related concepts and regional questions. So most of the people listening today are from Pennsylvania, so you probably understand the geographic background and context pretty well. Today I'm going to be talking about the Allegheny River, why it's an interesting river to study, how it came to be, and why this integration story perhaps teaches us something about how great rivers are integrated on continental scales and about the evolution of rivers and the mountains they flow out of. To do that, we're going to talk about some geological and geographic background, including a rapid review of some recent work on the dating of Glacial Lake Monongahela. The key question we're addressing is, of course, reading the incision rate of the Allegheny River. We are also going to be, then I'll walk you briefly through my methods and, most importantly, my new data that I'll be presenting on mapping the terraces along the middle Allegheny River, and then some interpretations and possible shall we say, implications. So for geographic context, now that everyone's had a little time to stare at this beautiful sort of polychronic diagram, we are in the western flank of the Appalachians, the Allegheny, and this is not a tectonically active area, which we'll come back to in a little bit. And so the main focus of my research was in this section of the river between Franklin, Pennsylvania here, and Parker and Emlenton down here. This sort of dendritic looking feller here is one reconstructed extent of Glacial Lake Monongahela, which was a large proglacial lake that existed in pre-Pleistocene time. So next we're going to kind of unpack this diagram and understand the Pleistocene and pre-Pleistocene geologic history of Western Pennsylvania and Ohio. So in pre-glacial time, on the leftmost panel labeled T0, before there was any northern hemisphere ice, there would not have been an Allegheny River, nor would there have been an Ohio River as we know them today. In this pre-glacial world, the drainages coming out of this part of the Western Appalachians would have drained to the north, up into an ancestral Erie Basin, and then out to some sort of ancestral St. Lawrence River. I have put two circles here and here to indicate some places where it's been suspected for some time that there were integration points or integration events at some point. Furthermore, as I will show, there is reason to think that this integration may have been coincident with the formation of the upper Ohio River from the former north-flowing Tays into the larger south-flowing river itself that was integrated, that we today call the Ohio, that was then integrated into the rest of the Ohio near a town called New Martinsburg on the West Virginia-Ohio border. And so this bit of the story, that there probably was some kind of integration and that the old rivers used to flow north, has been well established long time ago. Even Chamberlain and Leverett kind of were onto this idea. Then in panel T1 in the middle, the ice comes south sometime in the Pleistocene. It blocks those northwards flowing drainages as there is a wall of ice and a moraine. This then causes the water to back up and eventually form a large proglacial lake, Glacial Lake Monongahela, which again is this dendritic looking feller on panel T2 on the right-hand side. There probably were several instances of this Glacial Lake Monongahela separated in time. So thus, when the Northern Hemisphere ice sheet glaciations began, the former Upper Allegheny River was integrated with this part of the former Lower Allegheny Clarion River, which you can see here, to create the modern Middle Allegheny River. And we suspect strongly that Glacial Lake Monongahela and the various glaciations of the Middle to Late Pleistocene were part of this story somehow. So all of this is ideas that have been circulating. The story I've just told you has been, in its broad strokes, moderately well established for almost a century now. But we've been a little unclear on the precise timing and mechanisms, particularly within the Pleistocene. And so my work is going to be refining that. This slide, we are looking at here a set of maps of the Western Pennsylvania and adjacent parts of Ohio and West Virginia. Our panel on the right-hand side here shows essentially the same area as panel T3 in the previous slide. This is essentially the area that was drowned by Glacial Lake Monongahela. And then this red panel on the right matches this red panel on the left. The city of Pittsburgh is here. The city of Pittsburgh is here. And then this black panel matches this area in the valley of the Monongahela and some of its tributaries, which corresponds to this black panel on the left and the right. So what we're showing here is kind of a rapid review of some geochronology work done over the last 40 years that helps excuse me, that helps constrain, sorry, the nature of Glacial Lake Monongahela. So you can see in that red panel, that black area is the Carmichael's Formation, which is a unconsolidated surficial unit with a constructive surface of around 345 meters that is thought to be somehow related to Glacial Lake Monongahela. We also have depicted on this map a set of geochronological ages collected over the last few decades, many of them not yet published, which, while still uncertain and a work in progress, because we have both paleomag, simple burial ages, and some isochron TCN exposure ages. All of those numbers in bold are TCN, that is terrestrial cosmogenic nuclide ages, either via simple burial age models or isochron age models. But overall, this is pointing at two key ideas. One is that Glacial Lake Monongahela was definitely in existence. And these are sediments of Glacial Lake Monongahela shorelines and lake bottoms that were sampled by others. That Glacial Lake Monongahela was definitely in existence by around 1.1 million years ago. It spanned the 788,000 year magnetic reversal, so it was around for a good long while. And it likely had at least two distinct incarnations, with the youngest having emptied sometime after 475,000 years. And that about summarizes a bunch of what we know about the timing of modern Glacial Lake Monongahela. And so next, you've probably heard me rattle off terms like OSL and TCN. These are both burial dating methods. TCN stands for Terrestrial Cosmogenic Nuclide. This can be thought of as analogous to other radiometric dating methods, but different in ways I don't want to spend time on today. The key point here is that it is good for ages up to 12 million years, but can be subject to large asymmetric uncertainties because interpreting the atom count you get from the accelerator mass spectrometer requires you to make a bunch of assumptions about the burial history of the thing you're working with. And we'll see, which does not compromise its usefulness, but does mean that sometimes your uncertainties are a little wide. OSL/IRSL are both these luminescence dating methods. How they work is super cool on a physics level, but I don't want to get too far into it today. Essentially, electrons can get stuck in little crystal defects in quartz and feldspar crystals. During burial, these electrons are emitted, of course, by the breakdown of radioactive elements like potassium. And then when it's exposed to light, those electrons drop back down and emit a tiny little bit of light as they do so, which can be very, very carefully measured. And since there's a time-dependent accumulation, we can use it to date things up to about 600,000 years. Getting good samples in a non-shoreline facies is a little tricky, but possible. Requires rapid burial, not sensitive to burial depth, so long as there's enough sediment to block light. Sampling is fun. You pound a piece of aluminum pipe directly into the sediment and then pull it out in a way that you do not expose the sediment to light, ever. Because I'm mentioning this just because I'll be talking a lot about TCN and OSL ages in the rest of this talk. All right. So with that bit of background mostly out of the way, summarizing all of this, in preglacial time, we have these northwards flowing drainages of the upper Allegheny. At some point in the Pleistocene, glaciation initiates. Ice blocks northwards flow, creates Glacial Lake Monongahela, which must exist by around 1100 Ka, probably with multiple instantiations in that time period, and then gone sometime after 475 Ka. And then as the lake impounds the formerly northward flowing drainages, it forces the headward erosion and eventually overtops the old drainage divides at places like New Martinsville, which as is well documented in the literature. As we'll see here, we're pretty sure there was also an integration event near the town of Hawkesburg and Parker, Pennsylvania, near the confluence with the Clarion River. Right here. And
Yes, make the laser pointer a little larger.
oh, certainly.
It's kind of hard to see online.
So sorry.
Let's try that.
Oh, there we go. Oh, there we go. That's much better. Thank you. Right around here, we'll be spending a lot of time here today. And so the big question with all that kind of background out of the way is, what was the timing and sequence of these integration events and the creation of the modern sets of watersheds, and what else does it tell us about this system? So on the left here, we have a map of the modern Allegheny watershed and its major tributary streams, colored so that the key matches the long profile diagram here on the right. Looking at the long profile diagram, we can notice that the Allegheny River is quite steep through its middle and lower reaches, and that many of the tributaries that are flowing into the Allegheny are also quite steep. They end in a sort of convex lower reach, which indicates recent incision of the Allegheny, which on some level we know qualitatively must have happened because of the deep gorges it's in today. How many people online or not online have been to the city of Pittsburgh or anywhere near it? Yeah, you may have noticed the rivers are all in a bunch of deep, steep-sided V-shaped gorges. That right there is telling us there was some incision. The big question was, when did that incision happen? So, thus, by mapping the terrace elevations, we can construct a sort of paleo long profile diagram. And that lets us test various hypotheses, not only about the age of the incision, but about what might be driving that incision. Bluntly speaking, we can distinguish three broad hypotheses. If we map the terrace elevations, and they're all mostly subparallel to the modern river, then either was no integration, or the integration was far older than any of those terrace deposits. If we map the terrace deposits' relative elevations to the modern river, and they tend to converge upstream, hypothesis number 2, in that little inset box, then that would tend to suggest that the incision was driven by a change in base level. If the terraces diverge upstream, it would tend to suggest the integration was driven by a change in drainage area. The rest of my talk will be discussing these terrace locations, elevations, and ages that we can use to test these hypotheses. So, having said that, one final bit of background introduction. A quick aside on the regional geology. It's undeformed with a slight dip to the south. The bedrock is a sequence of Paleozoic sedimentary packages, so we can treat it as essentially homogeneous with respect to its erodibility as the river is in size. This is important because it lets me assume that bedrock erodibility does not meaningfully impact river incision rates across the study reach, which will become relevant for one of my interpretations towards the end of this talk. On the left-hand side, you can see a kind of DEM hillshade of one of our areas of interest, with showing the hypothesized integration reach right here. Between the towns of Parker and Emlenton, just in the southern part of the Emlenton Quad, right near just upstream of the confluence with the Clarion and Allegheny rivers. So just looking at this, you can see a kind of qualitative difference between the terrains north and south of this hypothesized integration point. If you kind of look at the DEM and squint a little, you can just about see the old drainage divide here, maybe. To the north, we have a less mature drainage. The terrain is more smooth looking. Many of the tributaries are short and barbed. That is, they are pointing the wrong way relative to the direction of flow. Remember, the river here is, broadly speaking, flowing from north to south. Many of these tributaries are kind of pointing the wrong way and forcing the water to make a more than 90-degree turn in order to flow the correct direction, and which is again suggesting that it's not a fully mature drainage. Whereas to the south, we have a very highly dendritic, highly dissected landscape with a set of fairly well-integrated fluvial landscape and mature drainages. So putting all of this together, this is a suspicion, and based on that projected elevation of Lake Monongahela shoreline we saw earlier, this would have been just about where its northern, sort of northeasternmost shoreline might have been. So then putting all of these things together, this is a suspicious place where if there was going to be an integration of this part of the old Allegheny watershed, it might as well have been in this area. And I want to be clear that this is not a novel and original hypothesis on my part. This is the same region that Chamberlain and Leverett and Jacobson and Wagner and others had been suspecting for close to 100 years now or more. But I'm going to go over some over the next dozen slides or so, some new terrace maps, sedimentology, and most importantly, geochronology data. And I want you here to notice this abandoned meander that you can see right about here, and this one here as well, because we'll be talking about it a lot in a few minutes. So this is the full study polygons, one of the key EdMap products. Expanding that last map out about a bit and then flipping it on its side because our screen is wider than it is tall. North is now off to the right. We can see again this qualitative difference in drainage patterns and topography, upstream versus downstream. Even at a glance here, we can see a difference in the terrace distributions. There are 8 major mapped terrace units, but as you can see downstream of the hypothesized integration point, there's a very rich terrace history with lots of big, thick fill terraces filling in these former abandoned meanders, now 50 plus meters above the modern river. Whereas to the north of that hypothesized integration point, we have a much sparser terrace history. Some of you may be wondering, why does it stop right here? And that's because my grant only was supposed to pay for covering the Emlenton and Parker quadrangles, but of course I kept finding interesting things as I went upstream. As I said, we've mapped 8 major terrace polygons here, which we can see named here. Most of them, though not all, are fill terraces. We have the fill terrace, strath terrace distinction as the schematic here. They have thick alluviums associated with them, and I'll be showing pictures of that to you shortly. However, some of them are very thin strath terraces, especially this QT4 unit, which you can not see very well on this map. It's in blue here, which is preserved very nicely here near the town of Parker. It's actually already in the literature as the Parker Strath. It's a wide flat strath mantled with fluvial gravel that's typically less than a meter thick, and some other workers have traced it quite far downstream. So then we can build a cross section approximately, but not precisely on this line A to A prime. And if we do that, we get something that looks a little bit like this. This is our synthetic cross section without any edges, just to give you a sense of the overall terrace architecture. Remember, these are fluvial terraces of the late Cenozoic. So the stratigraphy is inverted. The oldest terraces are what we are calling QT1 are at the top. The youngest ones are at the bottom. So if you're used to doing regular soft rock geology, this is actually backwards. You'll also notice this inset showing some of the tills that have been mapped up near the glacial margin near Franklin. The elevation, it's not just floating here randomly, the elevation corresponds to their true elevation in meters. So next we're actually going to look at some of these glacial margin sediments up near Franklin. Just as a reminder, that means we're zooming up here towards where the old glacial margin would have been according to other work, actually a fair bit south of it by a kilometer or two. And so you can see that this is about 35 kilometers as the crow flies from our original cross-section area, but nearly 70 kilometers, as the river wiggles. So then here we have some pictures of these 2 main units at the Franklin Quarry site, which we identified as the Mapledale and Titusville tills. Certain people in the audience who were along for the PCPG field trips a couple years ago may recognize some of these units. We have this till we identified as the Mapledale. It's the older unit, has a TCN age of about 400, that came back at about 400,000 years, but with a really wide uncertainty, probably because of incomplete burial shielding. Fortunately, we also have an IRSL age on the Mapledale, which came back much more tightly constrained at about 372,000 years, making the Mapledale a pre-Illinoisan MIS-10. This MIS-10 age is consistent with the deeply weathered soils, including deep red and deep blue redox colors, complete with ghost clasts in the reduced horizons, suggesting possibly weathering across multiple glacial interglacial cycles. We also have a little bit of preliminary, there are forthcoming geochemistry on these Mapledale soils. The younger unit here is the Titusville with an IRSL age of 142 Ka, MIS6 Central Illinoisan age, consistent largely with past work on other things called the Titusville. This is a pretty standard Illinoisan glaciofluvial deposit. Also in this photo, we see Gary Flieger, our colleague, whom was at the survey and helped collect samples at this site. We also have a little bit of preliminary profile geochemistry from the Titusville Cane at this site. A reminder, this is about 142,000 years old. We have moderate depletion and translocation. Notably, there is no accumulation of manganese at depth. Those of you who know something about Middle Pleistocene soils elsewhere in Pennsylvania, this is kind of curious, and I'm not sure why it's not there. We do also have some evidence that there may be aeolian input into this system, given the sudden enrichment in manganese and calcium towards the surface, although the relative depletion in potassium speaks against that. All of this is to say that this is broadly consistent with a fairly young soil that has undergone only maybe one beheading event in this area. So why did I just go through all this stuff with soil chemistry? Because soil chemistry is cheap and geochronology is expensive. So if you see a soil profile chemistry that looks kind of like this, maybe we can have some confidence that it's about 142,000 years old. That's my hypothesis. Moving on, we are going to be zooming in this area here, closer to Parker, Pennsylvania. One other map showing this area near the old integration reach, which would have been somewhere in here. Again, on a topo base, you can really see the both the old hypothesized drainage divide upstream of the confluence of the Clarion, as well as how these this big purple unit QT3 really fills in these old incised meanders. Also in this map, you can see these semi-paired strath terraces, QT4 in blue colors. So this is just kind of showing you again that there's a very rich terrace history south of the hypothesized integration, just upstream of, which would be right about here. You can just about see that old drainage topo high if you kind of squint. Whereas upstream, it's much scrappier, although there are a little bit of high terraces here and there, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. So we managed to get access to dig a big trench and sample this unit right about here. And this was my QT3 unit, which maybe is somehow correlative with Carmichael's formation, maybe. It does have a constructive surface at around 330, 340 something meters elevation. And it starts at the top as a lust and weathered fluvial deposit with open framework gravels. Then as you go down, the weathering decreases, although there's a pretty substantial amount of soil development with multiple decapitated B horizons. As you go down into this deposit, it becomes more of an open framework gravel, and then a nice well-stratified sand, complete with cross-bedding and trough cross-stratification. On the rightmost side, you can see a measured section. You can see that it's about 20 meters of section here, which is fairly typical of this unit, although the base elevation and therefore thickness varies. This unit is blanketing a pre-existing topography, and there is occasional diamict, yes, a diamict present at the base. I'm not sure if that's telling me something that maybe one of the glacial margins inched a little further south than we had previously believed. Not sure. Again, this unit generally in the map reach has a constructive surface at about 338 meters elevation, which is the tread is at that elevation, which is about 1,100 feet for those of us that use American units. Which is about 65 meters above the modern Allegheny River, which is, again, suspiciously similar to some of the other Carmichael's formation stuff in literature further downstream near Pittsburgh. We have two different methods that we use together to date this unit. I got a TCN age of about 1.1 million years, plus or minus quite a bit. You'll notice this asymmetric distribution that's very typical of these kind of TCN ages in excess of 500,000 years. Those of you who know how to read a banana plot can see that it plots here. The key point here is that, yes, I have a high confidence that this is the central age, but it really could be anywhere in that 1 sigma. However, further down, we collected a paleomag sample, and it came back paleomag normal. Wait, what? So that was really surprising. So I did it 5 more times and they all came back paleo-magnormal. So I'm pretty sure it's real. If we do have a unit in excess of 1 million years old, which is paleo-magnormal, that is probably putting us somewhere in the Jaramillo subchron, which in the literature is between about 1070 and 990 Ka. So I have strong reason to believe that we have a central TCN age of about 1.1 million years, and then a burial age, admittedly towards the bottom of this 20 meters of fill, somewhere in that range. Again, that's a burial age, which means that the incised meander that it's in has to therefore be older than that. How much older? Great question. All of that together tells us that this unit is, at least in its lower parts, has a burial age of around, and deposition age, therefore, of around 1 million to 1.1 million years. So maybe MIS 30 or MIS 31. We also have some profile geochemistry on the soils capping this unit. They look like this. This is the key thing to notice here is that aside from the sodium spike, which might be from the lust cap and might be from the road salt, not sure. There's a distinct manganese spike at depth. But otherwise, particularly in aluminum, silicon, and iron ratios, this is broadly similar to what we saw in the Titusville soil, which is, the better part of 1 million years younger. This gets at this idea of sort of regolith armoring, that much of the depletion must take place relatively early in the development of a soil profile, even in a fairly old soil. Zooming back out, and working our way down the strat column, we are going to next be looking at this area near, not far from Kennerdale, at this QT6 unit that we got here. We called this unit QT6 sampled it near Kennerdale, Pennsylvania. It is a well-washed, well-rounded open framework gravel. It contains exotic clasts. I just realized I forgot to mention that the QT3 unit also contains exotic clasts, sometimes as much as up to 20% of clasts over 4 centimeters in their longest axis. And as I mentioned, back to this QT6 unit, sorry to confuse you guys. Well-washed, well-rounded open framework gravel contains exotic clasts, sometimes as much as 30% or more. So definitely well connected to the glacial margin. At this point, we're far enough down into the valley, into sort of the inner gorge, that we're only about 15 or 20 meters above the modern river. The age of this deposit from burial TCN came back at about 500,000 years old. We do not, unfortunately, have a IRSL age on this sample because there were no sufficiently clean sands to run one. But it is clearly inset about 20 meters below our QT3. So the next, and our final outcrop, or penultimate anyway, that we're going to be looking at here, and our final geochron is of this unit I called QT7, one of the lowermost terraces. There's only 8 of them. Down here near the village of West Monterey. I did not have soil geochemistry on this one, but here's a very schematic soil diagram. This is a beautifully stratified sand deposit, only very, very gently weathered. The almost absence of a soil profile would suggest that this has not been in the landscape very long, and that is consistent with the IRSL age of about 17,000 years. So this is clearly a late Pleistocene terrace, and at this point we are less than 10 meters above the modern river level. So putting some of that together, we can see that there's a consistent low terrace suite along the inner gorge, basically the entire length of the Allegheny River from Kennerdale, maybe even as far north as Franklin, pretty much all the way down to Pittsburgh, that has more or less these same 3 units. And as you just kind of walk along the river, you can kind of see that there's 2 to 3 distinct steps. Sometimes they're a little hard to distinguish because of colluviation or often because of vegetation, but just on any given point along the river, if you kind of look across, you can kind of see these same 3 terraces, and this can be seen in photographs, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so just kind of keeping that architecture, it seems to be relatively consistent in terms of causes by cut and fill cycles, something like that. So then adding all of these ages back to our synthetic cross-section, we can begin to put together an actual incision history over the last million years or so as the Allegheny River has gone through multiple cut and fill cycles. And also looking at the glacial margin inset back at Franklin, we should notice that the Titusville and Maplesdale both represent times between QT6 and QT7, which is further evidence that there has been quite a lot of cut and fill cycles, only some of which are preserved here. As another side note, we also do have an exposure TCN from the modern Clarion River sediments, which remember the Clarion River was never directly exposed to glacial impingement. So this gives us a basin scale erosion rate of an unglaciated region, which is about 30 meters per million years. Next, we're going to be examining this cut and fill in more detail, but we can already begin to kind of put together a story that there's sparse straths with no fills in kind of QT1, QT2 time. Then there's a big fill burying a paleotopography around 1.1 or 1 million years. Then there's a period of incision but non-deposition relatively in QT4 and QT5 time between 1 million and 500,000 years. And then after 500,000 years, there's multiple cut and fill cycles, mostly constrained to within the inner gorge. So then using that exposure age, we can then plot all of these numbers of the sample age against their distance above the modern river, and we get a graph that looks something like this. This allows us to then say that we have an average incision rate, long-term incision rate, somewhere on the order of about 44 meters per million years, with possible evidence that it may have been lower earlier in the Pleistocene. As well as noticing that number is higher than our 30 meters per million years landscape scale erosion rate, and that 15-ish meters per million years difference is what gives us those deep gorges. So keeping in mind what I just said about possible evidence of an acceleration in incision rate over time, let's zoom back out from our cross-section to our map. And we now have multiple lines of evidence suggesting that, yes, this red circle in the integration reach really was an integration point, and that we have evidence here that that integration was already happening by 1.1 million years because we have terrace fills in QT3 that contain, in purple there, that contain these exotic clasts of glacial derivation. All of this geochronology data is also summarized in this illegible chart down here. So putting it all together, we can construct a longitudinal cross-section of the long profiles of the terraces and their paleo elevate, that is the sort of paleo long profile of the river constructed against the mileage of the river. And when we do that, we get this graph. So this is our long profile graph. What incision history story does this long profile graph tell us? I have summarized it here. Broadly speaking, it is telling us that in QT1 and maybe QT2 time, it may have been pre-integration. There may actually be these gradients pointing in opposite directions, suggesting that depending on whether or not I think QT1S is a separate unit from QT2, there was some question about this. Due to our only accessible site for QT2 being heavily anthropogenically modified. Thanks, oil industry. And then we can see that in QT, so there must have been a period of incision and entrenchment before 1.1 million years because something has to create those nice meander loops that are now 60 meters above the modern river at the Allegheny Clarion confluence. Then around 1 million years or so, there's the formation of Glacial Lake Monongahela. It backs up to someone near the confluence, which then creates the change, which is essentially the change in local base level that causes the aggradation of that QT3 fill terrace. That's my interpretation here. Remembering that these are terrace bases we're seeing here. So the top constructional surface is actually almost all the way up here. Then there's a period of base level stability that carves that Parker strath, which on this graph is these sort of yellow tinged green squares. Again, we can see that the QT3 and QT4 have relative gradients that kind of very gently converge upstream, thinking back to some of those early hypotheses. Then there's a period, and are also notably significantly less steep than the gradient of the modern river and of the units in the lower gorge. So that there's sometime after 500,000 years or so, there's a period of renewed entrenchment. Sometime between 1 million and 500,000 years, there's a period of renewed entrenchment that creates all these unpaired QT5 strats. And then by about 500,000 years or so, we've established a new base level in the inner gorge. And that means that by 500,000 years or so, the river was within 20 meters vertically of where it is today, with multiple juxtaposed fill terraces, presumably all tied to middle and late Pleistocene glacial interglacial cycles. And that's my interpretation of the incision history. Then, circling back, which of those original 3 hypotheses was correct? Remember the original 3 hypotheses? It's a little ambiguous, but some terraces have gradients greater than the modern stream, while others are a little less. My interpretation is kind of a little from column A and a little from H2 and a little from H3. I think that some of these terraces are clearly converging upstream. Others appear to be diverging downstream, although overall what we see is that many of the terraces appear to diverge downstream relative to the modern river, suggesting that overall there is a base level fall signal. But the fact that some of the terraces while not diverging upstream, the fact that we do have these 2 terraces that diverge upstream insofar as they have opposite gradients is telling us, I think, something about that drainage area change signal that the river may still be adjusting to. The fact that the gradients over time seem to grow increasingly steep is consistent more with a drainage area adjustment signal than it is with a base level fall signal. So we have kind of a mixed signal here. And so then putting that all together and circling back to our graph of the elevations relative of the known geochronologies relative to their distance above the modern river level, we can then take those slopes and plot where the units we do not have geochronology ages on would have gone, using various possible assumptions of that outlined in this chart here. And then if we plot all that on a graph, we get this graph showing potential age ranges given the known uncertainties on the A units we do have geochronologies on of the other age units. I will most especially draw your attention to 2 things. One is that QT6 is largely outside the possible uncertainties suggested by the age on QT3's incision rate, which is again just kind of showing us that suggestion that maybe the incision rate is accelerating over the course of the late Pleistocene somehow, as well as suggesting based on their relative elevations that our QT1 and QT2 may be well in excess of 900,000 years. Maybe in excess of 1 million, in excess of 1.1 million years, which again is consistent with the fact that neither has exotic glacially derived clasts. And that is sort of telling us that another signal that these may really represent units deposited either prior to integration or at least prior to the glacial lobe first impinging on this part of western Pennsylvania. This slide summarizes my conclusions, which I have already spent too long talking about, as well as some of these graphs. And we have once again in the background this beautiful air photo with our integration reach right here. Again, one of the things here is that this study is, I think, showing us is the importance of continental glaciation on driving incision and river rearrangement or integration, even in very tectonically inactive areas. And so one of the implications of this work is that maybe perhaps this can act as a sort of end member to the field of tectonic geomorphology for all the people trying to use river incision rates to infer fault movement rates in places like Utah and the Himalayas. Thank you. And we have almost 15 minutes available for questions.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. What do you mean by an exotic class? It's probably a simple question.
I use the term exotic classed to mean anything with an igneous or metamorphic petrology, which, given that the bedrock in this area consists entirely of Paleozoic sedimentary units,
Okay.
must have been brought in by a glacier.
All right. Okay, then here's the puzzle. How do you tell the difference between a baseline lowering, base level lowering, and a basin expansion? Not like in the process. Yeah.
So this gets at this question about so the idea is that if I have and this actually gets at a piece of my work that is still in process involving some modeling of some fluvial inversion models. But if we go back to beautiful map. So this is a beautiful map, but I want to go back briefly to our long profile diagram. And so the broad idea here is that if you have a base level fall signal, that means your, so let's use this one, a base level fall signal, that means that your Nick points are being forced to retreat upstream, which in turn, if your Nick points are retreating upstream, that means that your incision, that means that your over time, as the Nick points are being forced to retreat upstream, the gradient, the sort of paleo gradient of the river, will be gradually steepening and tending to converge upstream. That's the idea. And I'm still working on some mathematical modeling to kind of quantify that a little more precisely.
Jonathan, can you go back to your longitudinal profile? Siri, I'm having difficulty with all right, so the QT3
is this purple stuff here.
Yeah, and then your profile, your slope.
Yes,
your trend
is that line in purple here? Yes.
Okay, how did you derive that? I'm still having a hard time visualizing.
So what I actually did with this, and I may have, is if we go to one of the maps, what I actually did is I used ArcGIS for everything, is I essentially took my map polygons, I merged them all together, then I chopped them back up into numerous equal-sized pieces. Then I derived and so I had a set of official river miles in the Thalweg of the river that are defined by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And then I just did a little clever Python coding to say, tell me where the centroid of each of these polygons, which river mile is it closest to? And so I have the elevation of the polygon, which is derived from the DEM, or its lowest elevation of that segment, which is derived from the digital elevation model. And then that then gets plotted with that river mile that it is nearest to, which is why all of these are in whole mile increments rather than scattered all over the place, because I thought interpolating it any further would probably introduce error rather than remove it.
Okay, so the clustering there in QT3 is a product of the abandoned meander.
I think so, yeah. So part of what you're seeing is the clustering is where the abandoned meanders, because that's where there's accommodation space to preserve it. It's also remembering some of this variation in the base elevation is because, as I mentioned, we are blanketing a pre-existing paleotopography that only mostly aligned with the same flow direction of the current river. And so sometimes the unit's a little thinner and sometimes it's a little thicker. Again, all of QT3, although it's not shown on this diagram because it made it unreadably busy, can also be imagined as having a line that extends up a little bit to about 330 something, where they have a shared constructive surface.
I got some questions from online.
Please.
For future work, would you possibly be looking at mapping out their areas, like, for example, from the southern sections of the former lake? Like,
Let me
I'd like to ask is, like, where would you see future work?
Let me just go back to this diagram. So I think future work, the most promising mapping for future work would actually be further upstream, because naively looking at the old DEM, You can perhaps imagine places where there have been abandoned meander loops that are now filled with glacial material. It's a little hard to see on this diagram, but there are, so I would imagine trying to extend this further upstream, especially if this hypothesis about these very highest terraces lacking glacial clasts, it would be nice to try to find more outcrops of those. Often they get exposed only when someone has conveniently built a road on top of through them. Otherwise, they're often covered with colluvial wedges. In terms of mapping further south, there's already been a fair bit of work mapping Glacial Lake Monongahela. I actually mentioned this early in the talk. My former colleague at Lehigh, Ethan Kurak, did some thesis work in the valley of the Monongahela down here, driving. The other issue with working down in the Monongahela is also that there starts to be some structural complications to our interpretations, but that's not a barrier. That's a very long-winded way of saying other people are working south. I think the most promising avenue is working our way north along the Monongahela and trying to see, was there actually another integration point up here near Warren?
While you have that slide up, if you have a question, how far up the Allegheny River do you think the Pleistocene incision reached?
That's the million-dollar question, ain't it? I don't know. I think how far up the valley did the Pleistocene incision reach? Probably pretty far, given that the river is in a deep gorge across much of its length, basically until we get most of the way to the New York border. That said, more than one person, zooming way back out, more than one person has observed that the Allegheny River, upperish Allegheny River, parallels the map where we've mapped the glacial margin from Tills surprisingly closely. So it may be that the incision is kind of everywhere, or at least everywhere that is not been re-impinged by a subsequent glaciation, keeping in mind, of course, that this dotted purple line is an approximation. That was a lot of words to say, don't know.
Give you guys a chance? Anything? Okay. So any evidence that the old divide, as pointed out, is a vestige from a former glacial margin?
That there is no evidence at this time that is the case. Sorry, I'm just trying to zoom back to my long profile diagram. There is no evidence at this time that is the case. The main evidence that it is not the case, although absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, is that thus far I have not been able to find an exposure of these high terraces, QT1N, QT1S, QT2, that contains clasts of obvious glacial derivation. If it may be there, but I certainly haven't found it. If somebody else wants to go map a couple more quadrangles along the river and maybe they can find it, hey, that'd be cool.
Okay, another question. This goes back to your slide on the Glacial Lake Monongahela. Glacial Lake Monongahela. It's shown in that it's shown farther north and typically north of the Wisconsin margin.
This is probably actually a data processing error because this is my shoreline elevation, which is projected entirely on the basis of modern elevation and does not take into account isostatic effects. So that is probably a data processing error. And if you actually think about where the isostatic bulge would have been in the middle Pleistocene, yes, this bit here is probably imaginary, caused by I don't have a geodetic model that includes where the isostatic bulge was a million years ago. If anyone does, shoot me an email.
You got to make it through the online. Anyone else online have some questions? These are great questions. Yeah. Good. All right. Well, how about that? We're exactly on time. So let's thank Jonathan again.
Yeah.
So how did your defense go?
My defense went very well. I'm zooming
They
in.
didn't ask as difficult a questions as Ken.
Oh, they asked much more difficult questions. I'm just going to share, and since we're done, I'm just going to share with everyone 3 more things that were fun. One is there was not time for it today because I didn't want to, but I found this beautiful little cartoon that kind of explains how OSL works with its little imaginary electrons getting stuck. So credit to my friend Drusha Shin at Desert Archaeology for drawing this. And then those of you who have spent time along this section of the Allegheny River also know something about the challenges of the, as how we say, anthropogenic history. Far too many of the potential terrace deposits were also nice and flat tread surfaces that got used for building things like this waxworks that the Sterling Oil Company built some point in the 20th century. This is actually just a little upstream of the town of Emlenton, and I couldn't get access to it because there's a waxworks on the site, and they didn't want me to,
Find something.
to find something. Yeah, exactly. There's a former I don't think it's actually still in business, but they were not real enthusiastic about the idea of a geologist coming in, digging holes, and taking soil samples.
Now, is this the exact slideshow that you used for your defense?
Almost exactly.
Did I see a reference to hags for one of your slides?
Oh, yes. In my thesis defense, there was a slide that my final slide was miss anything. Wish you could all hear it again in more detail. I will be giving a talk.
That might be the first time we were given a plug at a thesis defense. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Yeah, that's right. All right. So thank you, Jonathan. And
Everyone.
parting thoughts here. Those of you who are in attendance, please sign in. I'm going to get you your certificates for May soon, maybe this weekend. We'll see. There's a lot going on this weekend. But yeah, we have until September, right? Because this is the end. We're coming up to the end of our PG cycle.
Yeah.
Just a reminder, everyone, we're renewing in the fall. Let's see. So that's it. We'll see you in September, and have a great summer. And thanks a lot. You guys have been great. Thanks for making the trip to Lehigh.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for coming today.